Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me. My name's Elaine Hutley. I'm a partner in the employment team at Irwin Mitchell, and we today are going to be looking at the issue of hybrid or agile working in the workplace and how we're going to approach that initially as Freedom Day is fast approaching, but then also take a longer term view, because this is a really hot topic and it's not something that's going to go away. It is going to affect your ability to recruit in the future and also to retain staff. So it's something that we need to get to grips with and use it for the best of the opportunity that we are being presented with. So before we go into the meeting, in the Q&A, I've just included my LinkedIn profile. So if this is something that you want to keep up to date with, as with other employment news from time to time, please do connect and link in with me, because we send out a lot of our updates via LinkedIn through Passels. So please do keep in touch. Thank you to everybody who submitted some questions before the event. I'm going to weave as many of those in as I possibly can during today's event. I also want this to be as interactive as possible. So please, for anybody who hasn't yet submitted any questions, if you do have any questions, comments, challenges for me, that's all perfect. I welcome as much feedback as possible during the session. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A as best I can, and I'll try and pick those up. But if I could just say as well, if you do have any questions that you post into the Q&A, can you add in your name and your organisation? That's not going to be published, that's just for us. But if I can't get to your question, or I think it takes more of a detailed answer, what I'll do is I'll drop you a line afterwards, either to let you have my comments or my responses by email, or to see if you want to have a chat about it. And there's no charge for that. So please do put your name and your organisation details in. So what are we going to tackle today? Because Agile, or the move to hybrid working, is such a wide topic and it's getting so much attention in the press. Employees on your shop floor or in your offices are going to be talking about it. So next slide, please, Amy. So the key topics that we're going to try and pull out today is to say, what are the key benefits and opportunities of Agile working? We're going to look at well-being and business performance issues, and then we're also going to try and look ahead and say, well, what are the potential pitfalls and the tricky issues, and what can we do to potentially avoid or mitigate against those? Next slide, please, Amy. So I am an employment partner. I specialise in employment. I will touch a little bit on health and safety because we've had some questions coming in. But first and foremost, any move to agile or hybrid working isn't just about the employment relationship. We now have an opportunity where any business can look and analyse and say, what do we want our workplace of the future to look like? And some of that, of course, is going to be employee related, but there's also other opportunities and advantages of doing that analysis now. So, for example, do you need the same fair square footage for your business premises as you had before? Is there an ability for you to reduce overheads, for example, by having a smaller office space or shop base? Are there advantages that you can glean from this situation? For example, will it affect how sustainable your business operates? Can you, if you are involved in tender processes, draw out the plus points of changing the way that your future workplace looks? Do you need to be in the place that you've always been in? You know, if you've always been city centre or town based, do you need that, or do you need it to the same extent? Do you want to afford employees the ability not only to work from home, but also to work from abroad? And lastly, to what extent do you need to implement an agile or a hybrid working? You know, it's not an all or nothing approach. And what we are going to see as every business does this analysis is that there's not a one size fits all. What you need and what's best for your individual business might be different to another business within the consumer sector or within your sector if we've got any non-consumer attendees. And so we're really going to have a flexibility of approach across the board. Next slide, please, Amy. So if we take that as a very broad approach, and then we look in more detail to say, but what about the employment relationship? Because that is the focus of today. How is your workplace for your employees going to look? And personnel today have done quite, as you'd expect, a lot of coverage on this. And a recent survey that they did drew out that actually it's not just about the working environment, but it's about your leadership culture as well, and the culture within your workplace. So there was an overwhelming response. 81% of people who took part in that survey said actually they're looking to employers and their managers in particular to have a leadership style which is based more on empathy and trust, and there is this increased focus on well-being and culture. And in terms of the pitfalls, if we flip that on its head, getting that wrong is going to affect your business in the short to medium term, and it is going to present challenges. So just having an awareness of this is what employees are looking for you to do is not only change potential working hours or places of work, but actually go much deeper than that, and look at culture and well-being and leadership styles, which means when you come away from this webinar today and you have your task list, one of the things and one of the takeaway points that you might want to consider is to say, stage one, do the analysis and see what we want our future workplace to look. Step two, do our contracts and policies and does our framework fit for that? And if not, do we need to change it? But stage three is also, how do we then embed that? Do you need to, for example, do leadership training or line management training to say, it's not just about having the policy, it's not about implementing it, it's about changing the culture of the organisation. So definitely they're going to be a three-stage approach. And why does that matter? Next slide, please, Amy. It matters because at the heart of the employment relationship is that psychological contract between us as the employer and our employees, and that hasn't changed. It's always been there. It's the implied duty of trust and confidence. But the way that we implement agile or hybrid working is going to affect that relationship balance. And you need to be mindful of it because it works both ways. So it's not just enough to implement a hybrid or an agile working policy. It's about what underpins that method of working and the culture. So do you trust your staff 100% when they're working from home? If not, any model of hybrid working is going to be a challenge for you to implement. But likewise, this is a two-way street. So do your staff trust you that then when they work from home, the business isn't going to assume that they're just doing the basic minimum or they're not skiving? Because actually, if you have a remuneration structure that includes not only salary but bonuses, and other allowances maybe that are performance based, do they trust you that if you can't see them for 9 till 5 days a week, that you're going to offer them the appropriate reward at the end? So again, it's not just having a policy that covers hybrid or agile working, but it's reviewing all your other policies to say, have we thought about how they're going to be impacted as a result of this new way of working? And if they are going to be impacted, what are we going to do to review them, and also to communicate any changes to employees to make sure that they understand that this is a whole scale change and that we are worthy of that trust, and in return we expect from them the return investment of their time and their commitment and their best efforts, because we are going to reward them if they put that work in. Okay, next slide please, Amy. So issues and challenges. Next slide, please, Amy. So first of all, I thought I'd just take stock because already in this webinar, we're 10 minutes in and I have used agile working and I've used hybrid working, and I do use them interchangeably. Some people might not. And on the screen there, I've just included what the agile organisation consider is meant by agile working. So they look at it as a shift probably to the more extreme end of what some people might think of agile working, where it's not only that there's flexibility over time and place of work, but also that there's a fundamental shift to say, actually, the focus is on performance and outcomes rather than being task oriented through the day. Now, the extent to which, excuse me, you can embrace that extent of agile working will depend on your organisation, the job roles within your organisation. Other people might say, well, we're not shifting to the outcomes. We still expect people to be working during working time, and it is more how many hours and what tasks are you doing, but you might adopt agility in terms of just the place and the time of flexibility. And then we say hybrid as well, which, because agile working could be sometime in the office or the workplace, sometime working from home, that is still agile. But lots of people are saying rather than agile, which I think is more free-flowing, hybrid. So a lot of the expectations remain the same, but there is this time, place flexibility. So hybrid working, sometimes in the office, sometimes at home, sometimes if you need them to work, for example, at client sites. So for the purposes of today, I'm not drawing a distinction between agile and hybrid working, just in case anybody was going to question that. So where are we at currently? Next slide, please, Amy. So the legal position hasn't changed, albeit that employees are being encouraged at the moment until Freedom Day to work from home where possible. But if you are thinking of having everybody back into work come Freedom Day, and you have employees who approach you to make a flexible working request, they will still be doing that under the flexible working request regime. And this has been criticised over the years because it's limited who can apply for a flexible working request, in that it's employees only. They do have to have at least 26 weeks service, and they can only make one application a year. It's also quite easy for an employer to refuse a flexible working request under the statutory regime, because you just have to fit within one or more of 8 specified reasons, and there isn't really anything that an employee can particularly do about that. If you refuse a flexible working request, sometimes it might cross over into discrimination territory, but really the regulations don't have an awful lot of teeth. Next slide, please, Amy. It's also a right to request, not a right to obtain it. And a lot of the commentary that we are seeing at the moment, for those of you who aren't aware, there is an employment bill that's going through Parliament to try and shift the emphasis. So some of the suggestions are that regardless of whether you're an employee or a worker, there should be an expectation of flexibility unless an employer can give a good reason why flexibility and flexible working can't be accommodated. We're going to have to see where that goes, because the government have got to balance the need to win the popular vote. And in 2019, the government did set out in its manifesto that it was going to review this and it was going to support a more flexible approach and greater rights for employees and workers to request it, versus the current commentary that we've got all over the news at the moment about the fact that our towns and our cities are really struggling because of the loss of commuters and the loss of people going into work. So it will be interesting to see, now that that's been resurrected, where that debate comes out, and it is going to be a very tricky balancing act for the government. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. So as I say, are we going to be in a position where we will have flexibility by default? It is currently being considered by the government, and it's not something new. I think this is the important point. The pandemic has most definitely accelerated the push for normalising flexibility. But actually, as I've said, not only did the Conservative government have it as their manifesto in 2019, but there was also, if you remember back to 2019, which, gosh, doesn't it feel like a long time ago, recommendations for better flexibility rights was included in the Good Work Plan, and there was even a flexibility or a flexible working task force that was set up in 2019 as well. So the push has always been there. In some ways it's been kind of stayed by the pandemic, but then at the same time momentum has gained as a result of the pandemic, because if I look at our sector, you know, law firms were not known for being the most technologically advanced. We are were very office based. If anybody had said to me in March last year, you know, a week before we had to send everybody home, everybody is going to have to work remotely, I wouldn't have believed it was possible, yet we did it in 24 hours. And if, you know, antiquated law firms like us can imagine what, you know, those of you in the consumer sector, or if we've got anybody on from the manufacturing sector, I saw a couple of names, you know, imagine what you can do to the extent that it's permissible within your business. Next slide, please, Amy. So then the question is, change is coming. It's coming in one shape or another. As an employer, you're going to be under pressure from whatever comes out of the employment bill, and the flexible working request regime is going to change. But even before that, you're going to be under pressure from employees over the next few weeks and months, and definitely year. And then you are also going to be under pressure, not only from the employees that you have, that you want to retain, but you're also going to be under pressure when you want to attract talent. And there is a talent war out there in so many sectors and so many industries. And one of the pushing agenda points that you're going to get on, you know, employer review sites like Glassdoor, or you're going to get it in your recruitment process and your interview process, is what can you know, what's your approach, what's your policy on remote working, hybrid working, flexible working, etc. So if it's something that we have to embrace and we have to plan for, and as we've already said, there are advantages to the business, so it's not just an employment point of view, what do you need to consider? Because it's more than just implementing a policy. So you've got to think about the tax consequences. You have to think about immigration, of who you're going to attract, how you're going to attract them, can you sponsor them in light of Brexit. We've got to think about employment protections and effective line management, because it is fundamentally going to change a line manager's approach to things like performance management, disciplinaries, etc. You've got data protection issues of someone working remotely. You'll also have confidentiality issues. So if you've got somebody working from their home, how do you make sure that that is secure, so all your confidential information is being protected by your employees, when instead of having all your confidential information on one site, you've now got it on your main site, but then you've got employees taking all that home. You've got health and safety issues. So we did have a couple of questions that came in pre-event. The first one was to say, I'm just looking at my screen now, if how far do the employees' health and safety obligations go for those employees who are given the opportunity to work from home? So they are still your employees and they are still working for you. So do you need to consider, if you have a policy, for example, for lone workers? If not, you might need one if they're the only person in their house during the day. And also your obligations to do risk assessments for their working environment, to make sure that they have a proper desk set up. They've got, you know, everything that they would have in the office in terms of screens, monitors, appropriate chairs, enough space. And you've got to make sure that you now adapt your health and safety risk assessments and policies to take that into consideration, because yes, they're working from their home, but it's working time, it's on your work, it's working on your work, and they're your employees during that time. So yes, you will have to have a look at it. And somebody else said, what are the obligations for an employer in providing home working equipment? Yes, you do. So I know a lot of my clients at the moment who are implementing this, who have said employees can come to the office and collect, excuse me, can collect some equipment and take it home with them, subject to doing a review to see how much you need to stay in the office. Others are doing it via an expenses up to a certain amount. But yes, you do have to take responsibility to make sure that they are working safely at home and that it is possible for them to do so. Somebody else has also said, just looking at the wider ramifications, say, well, could this affect our expense policy? So if they are allowing employees to work remotely voluntarily, so they're not contractually obliged to work from home, but they are choosing to do so, but then those employees are now saying, well, can they claim mileage when they come into work? because actually their normal place of work is from home. You might, it really depends on how you choose to frame where the place of work is. So if the place of work remains your office location or, you know, your work address, but from time to time you allow them the flexibility to work from home, their normal place of work hasn't changed. It's still the workplace. So no, they don't get expenses as you wouldn't. But if you do change an employee's contract so they do work from home and home becomes their normal place of work, if you require them as part of their job to travel anywhere else, then yeah, expenses might be payable in those circumstances. So again, that's one of the nuances you're going to have to consider when we say how flexible, how far do you want to push out hybrid working. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. What I've tried to do on this, because as I've said, it is a very, very broad topic, is to pose just a list of questions that you can take away afterwards to sit down when you do your analysis to say what do we want to implement and how are we going to do it. So the first one is, can you or will you change the way that you work for your whole business or just limit it to certain groups? And this is again another hot topic, because I'm advising clients at the moment where they're conscious and they're mindful that because they might not be able to operate hybrid working for everybody, you know, some people who work in a shop or cafe, they can't work remotely, they've got to be in the shop or cafe. Some people who work in manufacturing, for example, and work on a shop floor using machinery can't. So you might be in a position where some groups of your business, some departments, some teams can work remotely, some can't, and you might have a middle group that can do a bit of both. And we are getting lots of questions to say, well, how is that fair? And there's also the follow-on ramifications to say, well, you might have a group of people who now can work from home and their daily costs go down because they're not paying for expensive train passes, they're not paying for bus passes, etc. But then you've got the group who have to come into work and are still incurring those expenses, and they feel hard done by because they're not benefiting from the flexibility. So there's lots of practical issues that you need to preempt, but also how to make sure that when we think about your culture, so if we go back to what I was saying at the beginning, say you have to change your culture to make sure that it remains positive and properly embeds any hybrid working. How do you stop having a two-tier system? Because the danger is that you could say that some senior managers or officers are allowed to work from home and they get that flexibility, but then other people on your shop floor or customer facing can't. And if you don't handle that situation carefully, and if you don't ensure that you communicate the positives and explain the reasons why you know one size fits all, you can end up with a two-tier system, and one group of your employees might feel like the poor relations out of the deal. So something to think about there. You've also got to think about who is going to manage that change, and it's not just the role of HR, because as I say, this isn't just about having one policy change and one set of communications. It's about leadership. Your employees, 81% of them said they're looking for a change in leadership style. So this can't be just a HR initiative. The change has got to come across the business. Will the changes be optional? So again, it's not necessarily about you enforcing where people work, but it could be about giving them the power to choose, but built in with parameters. If you are potentially changing the contractual arrangements for 20 or more employees, there might be a duty to collectively consult. And again, it comes back to what you are proposing and whether there is a contractual change or whether you're just implementing a policy which allows a degree of flexibility. But if you think that actually you might trigger the collective consultation requirements, please speak to us. Everybody always shudders when I mention collective consultation, because when you start to think of it, it feels like this really cumbersome process that you've got to get through. And most people, if we're if we're talking about collective consultation, link it to redundancy, which obviously is a negative process, but actually I like collective consultation. It gives you a time frame, it gives you a mechanism by which that you need to follow the steps and follow the procedures, and in my view it makes life easier to follow that process. Someone else has planned it out for you, let's take advantage of it. And in this context it's a positive message that we're consulting on. So yeah, let us know if you need a hand with that, or if you're questioning if you trigger those requirements. You do also need to think, as I say, about secondary considerations. So once you've identified what you want to do, you know how you're going to do it, you've got to preempt some of those other changes that would be easy to overlook. So your confidentiality provisions, your restrictive covenants. So for example, how are restrictive covenants affected? If you change the place of work for an employee, that might affect your restricted covenants, because sometimes it could be that you have a geographical restriction there that says they can't, for example, go and work for a competitor within a 20-mile radius of their place of work. You've just shifted your geographical location if you change their terms and conditions, so their place of work is now home, not the office or not your work premises. And data protection. You've got to review your data protection policies under GDPR just to make sure that you've got everything still in order. Health and safety risk assessments, I've already talked you through those. So yes, you are responsible, and yes, you do need to do them, and you might need to review your health and safety policy as well. The next one, I've included it as a bullet point, but I could literally do a whole session on it, and maybe we will if there's interest in it, to say moving to a hybrid working environment and changing your culture is going to change the way that your line managers and your staff interact. It will be a lot less informal. You know, now if I want to speak to one of my team, rather than just bumping into them when I've gone to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, and it's easy to have that informal conversation, now you have to phone them over Teams. So there's a real purpose to it, there's a formality to it. Likewise, if employees are struggling either in sort of performance or well-being, or they're not feeling particularly well, it's easier for them to hide when they're working remotely. So the culture is going to have to change that. Line managers need to be upskilled and think about how they're going to tackle those issues, and it's going to be even harder. You know, we do lots of sessions about teaching line managers how to have difficult conversations, and it's something that nobody likes to do. That's going to be even more difficult to have that difficult conversation when you're doing it remotely. So think about training requirements, think about culture, think about leadership. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. So I've tried to have a look at it now from a business point of view, but before you make any of those big decisions, do you know what really matters to your staff? Because I think sometimes there is a real assumption, and it definitely comes through in the press, in some of the news articles that you see, is that there is an assumption that employees don't want to return to work, that they want flexible working or they want hybrid working. But I sometimes think that that is a little bit misunderstood. And within my own team, I know lots of people are really keen to come back to work. They want that social interaction, they want that team ethos, they want to get involved, they just want people. They're fed up of screens. So I think it would be really easy to assume and to run away with ourselves and say we're going to introduce flexibility, we're going to say people don't need to come back into the office, and actually that might not fit for your organisation. And people say you only get one chance to make a first impression. The same is true on this. You want to get it right first time rather than implement it, it doesn't really work, and then you've got to make adjustments. That's not going to get you the employee buy-in and the positivity that you really want. So next slide, please, Amy. I just pose this as a question to you so you can take stock now and say, do you know how your employees are feeling? So over the last sort of 15 months, have you, during the pandemic, been measuring employee engagement or well-being? And how has your communication been during the pandemic? I did a webinar recently, and I was one of a number of panel members, and there was one of my co-speakers was a communications expert, and what she was saying was really interesting, because she said she'd worked with lots of businesses who had fundamentally shifted their, not only their tone of communication, but their pattern of communication. So rather than sending out pre-pandemic what would have been a monthly or a weekly update, she worked with them to have a better consistency, so that there would be sort of more frequent but shorter messages. And she also tried to move a lot of her clients away from just email updates to maybe using video content, because it helped with that personal interaction. So I guess the question to you now, just to reflect on, is did you do something similar? Did you change the way that you were interacting with staff? If not, if you did, brilliant. What do you need to change now if you move into a more hybrid working? Will you keep with the way you were doing it, or will you ease back to what it was pre-pandemic? If you didn't, maybe now is the time to think about it. If you're going to introduce a more agile or hybrid way of working, do your communications need to reflect that? And interestingly, I've just put it as the last slide. 86% of workers feel that their employer is responsible for improving the world of work. I've got to say, that shocked me. I didn't realise the extent and the reliance on which is placed on employers. I would have thought employees would have felt more empowered to come to you. So I think it's just worth being aware of that, to say you can't assume that what you're thinking is what your employees are thinking. They're actually looking to you more than ever for more guidance and to be proactive in changing the way that we're working. So it's even more important, given that level of expectation that is on us, to understand what it is that they're looking for us to do and what will work for your employees in your business. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. Whatever you implement, and this is one of the potential pitfalls, is we are seeing a huge increase in the number of clients that are approaching us around mental health issues and well-being. So if you don't have a mental health first aider in your business, I recommend it's something that you look to introduce, because even introducing it in itself is a positive. It sends out a message to employees to say that this is something that you are investing in and you recognise. And again, your mental health first aiders won't breach confidentiality, but they can be an alternative to a source of information for you to say, how is any sort of hybrid model working or not working? So they can give you generic feedback of some of the issues or the types of things that people are worried about, but without naming names and without breaching confidentiality. And employees are dealing with a huge amount at the moment. So homeschooling, job insecurity, anxiety, not only just about potentially returning to work and the implications of getting on, I don't know, public transport, or just coming back into an environment where they're around people, but generally anxiety outside of work as well. Anxiety about going on holiday or not going on holiday, that's going to impact them on a day-to-day basis, and the lines have most definitely been blurred as a result of home working at the moment, because it's not live to work, it's working at home when you don't get the balance properly. And it's about being as proactive as possible, not just a tick box approach. But again, if we go back to that sentiment earlier on, employees are looking for a leadership change which is focused on well-being and health. So the more that you can do, and it doesn't take a lot to introduce a system of mental health first aiders, feeds into that culture, you're meeting their expectations and you're going to become an employer of choice. You'll retain your talent and you will attract new talent when you need to. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. Now, if we are going to implement any sort of agile or hybrid living, the impact of technology is great in some ways for anybody who needs that degree of flexibility. And if a bubble bursts at school and you're a working parent, the fact that you can work from home whilst your child's doing remote learning is absolutely brilliant. But what we have lost is the commute. And that is a really, or was a really important divide. In the mornings, you get to go in your car or you sit on the train, you can organise your thoughts. At home, you know, home time, you can leave the office behind you and you can switch off and then it's home. We've lost that divide. And again, this is going to be something that if we don't get it right now, you're going to have to get it right at some point, because the European Commission is looking at a right to introducing a right to disconnect. Now, we're not in the EU anymore, but we're not going to be immune from that. Ireland have already as well introduced a similar right. It is going to come, and so it's better now, if we are thinking about a model for hybrid or agile working, that we preempt those issues. So as and when the right to disconnect is introduced, which I am absolutely sure it will be at some point in some way, shape or form, our policies already can accommodate that or require very little amendment. So think about how, if you introduce some sort of hybrid or agile working, you're going to give the employees the ability to say, as of this point, it's my non-working time. And again, I can't give you a form of words. There's no one size fits all, because your business will have different roles that have an ability to switch off at different points. So you're going to have to find out what works within your organisation and within your teams. Next slide, please, Amy. So planning for the future. I know I've been talking at you for 35 minutes, and I know I've given you a huge amount to think of, and if anybody wants that, we'll send the slides out after this session, but hopefully some of you have been jotting down some thoughts about what you want to tackle, what you want to introduce and how you're going to do that. My very skeleton overview is: one, reflect. What can you learn about remote working during the pandemic to the extent that you could accommodate it or you had to accommodate it? So think about your staff. Think about, for example, have you got anyone in your teams who is, for example, in their early 20s, they're working from home. It is likely that they are not going to have an office or a study or a spare room where they can set it up. You know, there is a difference between all your employees. You might have some, you know, some more younger, for example, employees who are renting their first property and they're sitting at their dining room table working. Their needs are going to be very different to some of your other employees who might have spare rooms or might have a home office set up. They will have different levels of anxiety about different things. So it's not a one size fits all. Have a look at the demographics and the makeup of your employees. Have a look at the ability to which they can work from home or not, and then come up with a plan. As I've said, communications is going to be absolutely key. You might, as I've said, have changed the way that you've communicated with staff. If not, you're going to have to think about how you communicate with them over the next couple of weeks, ready for Freedom Day and then beyond. And it is absolutely fine to say that you might have a different approach. So you might accommodate one thing in the very short term, but then look to move something for longer term. And then how are you going to implement your hybrid or agile working? So first and foremost, you are going to have a strategy or a plan or a policy. And I recommend that that's documented so everybody understands what it is and what it is you're going to do. You need a really good way to communicate that so there's no misunderstandings, and that might include training. I think it's good to explain to employees what the business needs are. You know, don't assume that they will naturally understand that, and the business need will also help you to explain any differences between teams or departments if you can't or can partially accommodate flexible working or agile hybrid working. And also emphasise the wellbeing points. As I've said, this is something that employees are really looking to employers to lead on. So make sure that you don't take for granted what you're doing, but that you actually tell employees, you know, take credit for all the good stuff that you've been looking at and that you're doing. Next slide, please, Amy. And then job satisfaction and productivity. As I've said, at the moment, we are across the board in a fight for talent. I act for lots of clients in lots of different sectors. I also act for some in the recruitment sector as well. Due to multiple factors, Brexit being one of them, immigration considerations, there is a fight for talent out there at the moment, and there's plenty of studies, you don't need me to tell you about, the fact that engaged, motivated employees help productivity. So getting this right is going to help with your staff retention, without doubt, but it's also going to affect your ability to fight for that limited talent that's out there at the moment, because there is going to be an expectation that some sort of flexibility, agility, hybrid working is going to be offered at some point. So I'm just going to run quickly through some questions that have come in. So one pre-event question that we had that I didn't weave in, but I'll come to now, is to say, well, what do you do if you've got people who are reluctant to come back into work, and it's not something that you want to accommodate in the long term to do home working, and they're just reluctant? We're getting lots of questions on this. Freedom Day is coming, and we are being encouraged to return to some sort of office working, place of work. If you need employees back in the office, either in the short term because you need them to do their role, or in the longer term once the requirement isn't work from home where you can. So once that's lifted and you need them back in, you can require them to come back in. Absolutely, there's no problem with that at all if contractually their place of work is the office. Now, if we just arbitrarily call them back in and just rely on that contractual provision, it is likely that they will make a flexible working request if they can. So if they're an employee with 6 months service and they've not made one in the last 12 months, so you might have to deal with that. But also they might be quite vocal, they might become disengaged. So again, I think it comes back to, if before we get to that point, we have thought about how and to what extent we can and we want to implement hybrid working, actually that might take some of the anxiety or some of the reluctance to come back into work. But if you've got, and I think these two should run in parallel. On the one hand, we should be thinking at an organisation and a business level to say, what do we want our workplace to look like? Can we accommodate any hybrid or agile working, and if so, to what extent? That's an organisational approach. If you've then got individuals who aren't quite with you on the rollout of that programme, I think it's really important that you understand what their hesitation or what their reservation is, and we get a full spectrum of why people might be reluctant to come back into work. So sometimes it might be the case they're just anxious. They come in on public transport, they haven't had COVID yet, they don't want to get COVID, and they're just a bit scared. It could be that actually if you sit down with them and you talk them through your risk assessment, if you can, for example, offer them flexibility so that they don't need to come in at rush hour so they can avoid the trains or the buses at peak times, or if you anything that just makes them feel more comfortable that they aren't at risk because we've complied with our health and safety obligations to reduce that risk to the lowest level, that just might get them over it. Other people might be struggling for childcare reasons. Other people might be struggling simply because they've enjoyed homework and they don't want to come back in. They don't like the commute. They feel that they can work positively and effectively from home. So if you are looking at an organisational level for hybrid working, but some people are still reluctant, understand why and then take it from there. And if you need any support, please let us know, because as I say, we're doing this with lots of clients, and thankfully, touch wood, we seem to be able to resolve the situation without having to take drastic action of disciplinaries or dismissals because someone refuses to come into work. Okay, just looking down a couple of questions. So one, can an employee work from home from the Irish Republic for 3 months? They could. It's up to you whether you want to allow them to. And you would also, I think for 3 months it's okay, but there are potentially tax implications if you have people who are working abroad. It came out about 6 months into the pandemic, I think, that actually a lot of employees had gone abroad to work. One of the more extreme examples was I heard of an employee who had actually rented a holiday home on a long rental in Antigua or Barbados and was quite happily sitting working in the Caribbean. The employer didn't know that was more than just a short-term arrangement, so there's potential tax consequences, but speak to your accountants. But if you are happy for the employee to work from another country, then that's up to you. Likewise, if actually like that employer who had someone working from Barbados realised actually the tax implications of that were too hard, then you can refuse it. It's up to you. So provision. Oh, I've got a follow-up question about the provision of equipment. Do you think it's reasonable to require employees to insure the equipment on their own contents insurance, and are there potential enforcement problems with doing so? That might be difficult because they don't own the property. So I think you'd have to have a look at it, but it will be covered by your insurance anyway. So I think the business would have to have a look at its insurance policies to reflect the fact that actually some of your employees work remotely, and therefore some laptops, etc., might be taken away from the work premises. So I think it's actually more of a business issue than an individual issue. Another one, if you chose a hybrid model and align your infrastructure to 4 days work from home and 1 to 2 days max in the office, can you reasonably call the office an employee's place of work, allowing flexibility to work from home and not pay travel expenses? I think you can. But what I think would happen there is you would have to have a look at your contract. So if you said, for example, you can work 4 days a week, but 1 day in the office, but your contract says, but you have to be available even on your 4 working from home days to attend the office if needed or to attend meetings, then you wouldn't have to pay them expenses, because it's envisaged that even though typically they might work from home 4 days a week and 1 day in the office, if actually they had to come in more than 1 day, that's still a requirement of their role. So I think you've got to be realistic. And also you've got to make sure that you don't deviate too much away from it. So if, for example, you had a contractual provision that says you absolutely work 4 days a week from home and only 1 day in the office, and then despite that you're requiring them to come into the office every day, that might be a different story. So I think you've got to draft your contractual clauses in a way that gives you the flexibility to say, we will give you the advantage of working from home, but you'll, if needs be, you will have to come into the office, and you accept that as part of the package, and there's no additional expenses to be paid. Okay. Right, so we've got one here. Is it possible to require employees to be able to provide certain conditions at home to enable them to work from home entirely, or as a hybrid strategy, for example, minimum broadband speeds? Yes, I think you absolutely can. And likewise, I think if you allowed someone to work from home and actually they were having IT or technological issues such that they weren't effective, then I think as long as you have said that you're affording them the ability, as long as they can work effectively, if there's then performance issues, I think you can call them back into the office. And if you wanted to go so far as to say they had to have a minimum broadband speed, I don't see why not, as part of the policy, to say you can't be in a situation where you can't work effectively. Right, I think we've covered most of I think that's all of the questions. I'm just running through them now. No, there's one other question. If you adopt hybrid approach, do you have to provide and pay for equipment both in the office and at home? I can see that could be an issue, but I think that comes down to you would do an assessment of how you would practically manage that. So if, for example, at an organisational level, you said we will have a hybrid working policy, but the advantage of that is in the office we aren't going to have a desk for everybody, because what's the point of paying for a huge square footage of office if actually the majority of your employees are going to work remotely? So it might be that actually you could have a minimum amount of IT desks, you know, spare keyboards, etc. Although most people would probably take their keyboards. So I think, yeah, you would probably do an analysis to say on a typical given day, if we have this many number of employees with the ability to work remotely or on a hybrid basis, what's our maximum capacity in our office? So I don't think you would have to double the cost to say we have one set of equipment at home for everybody and one set of equipment in the office. I think we would be more sophisticated about that to say we will have a limited resource in the office, and we would also identify technology that people would transport between. So instead of having desktops at both locations, you would have a laptop that they bring with them and a mouse that they bring with them. And, you know, these days keyboards are so small that you would probably, and also for health and safety reasons, say you bring your keyboard with you. So I think actually it wouldn't be double the cost. I think we would just be smart in how we implemented the policy. Okay, that's all the questions that have come in, unless any ping up in the next couple of minutes. What I would just say is, as I said, please connect in with me on LinkedIn. We share a lot of material. I've also we've created, just because we were getting so many questions on it, an Agile working toolkit, which includes a checklist of everything you need to be thinking about before you decide and then implement on a hybrid working or an Agile working policy. We've got a policy as a starter, a template policy as a starting point that you can then amend and fit to suit your business. We've got contractual clauses that you can introduce your contract, which will then dovetail with the policy. We've got a draft letter to staff, and we've got an FAQs document. So if anybody is interested in those, please drop me a line and I can send you details. We are also creating a flexible working toolkit as well, which is similar, but will hopefully preempt some of the changes we've got to some of the flexible working updates, you know, pressure that's coming in. And then my final plea is just, could you please complete our feedback form? It's really important to us that the topics that we do events on is what you need and what you will get most benefit from. So please let us know what your burning issues are at the moment, not necessarily just employment. We've got, you know, lots of teams, property, commercial, litigation, and we will make sure that our future events suit your needs. But otherwise, I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you for your questions during the session. Thank you to those who submitted them in advance. Amy's just put on there our final screen. There's lots of resources and lots of information on our website, including our coronavirus hub. But as I say, if you don't want to delve through a website, please just give me a shout. But otherwise, thank you ever so much for today.